Jennifer Levi has dedicated her career to fighting for the rights of women, children, the poor, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender clients. A professor at Western New England University, she recently received the American Bar Association's Stonewall Award, and she sat down with me to discuss her pioneering work.
Much of my work is really interconnected, but I do feel really proud of a case that I worked on in Maine representing a transgender student who was denied access to the girls' restroom at her school and ultimately had to leave her community because of the discrimination she faced.
Back in 2009, around that time?
Yeah.
And so that case in particular, do you think that it opened up areas for other students, or what is it about that case that stands out for you?
Yeah, I mean, a number of things stand out for me. For one, it was the first case decided by any state high court that recognized that a transgender student has to be given access to a restroom consistent with her gender identity. It also brought the issues relating to transgender students really into the public discussion. And so it both changed the law and I think changed the conversation about an important issue.
And transgender educators have been in the news a lot lately, especially here in Massachusetts with the case of a principal in Swampscott. And it got me thinking about, is this something that teachers and parents should be talking to their kids about? The fact that transgender people exist and need to be discussed. You know, what should the discussion be for these parents and educators, you think?
I mean, I think the conversations have to take place, and they are taking place because transgender young people are in the schools. And for the children and their peers, it really is just part of their ongoing experience. And so it is that much more important to have the model set by educators and by parents to really support individuals in the school, regardless of who they are, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation or racial characteristics or religious identity. And so it's really just part of the broad discussion about diversity and inclusion that needs to be taking place in schools.
Why do you think that sometimes, I think especially for heterosexual communities, maybe this is a difficult conversation for them to be having? What would you suggest to these parents who say, you know, my kid is in elementary school, they're too young for me to be discussing this topic with them?
You know, I think it's new for a lot of people, and I think like any other new issue, there might be discomfort around it, but that's been the path and the trajectory of the history of civil rights work generally, is that as people get to know other people and really see beyond the superficial differences, that it's much easier to accept and support all of the kind of differences that are in schools, but also in our community. And so what's really important is that, you know, parents don't know what their children's path will be, and I think anybody either with or without a transgender child would want to have a world that is safe for that child to really become fully who that young person is. And so all of the support and the changes that we make in society to have, you know, broader inclusion of individuals benefits all of us. And so that's why I think even though it's new, there's a lot of models for how to have the conversations. There's training available. The State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has issued very specific guidelines about how to ensure a safe environment for all students at school. And I think it's the law to ensure equality for all students, and so being able to talk about that comfortably is essential to changing school climate.
One of the cases that you've been involved more recently was looking at transgender rights in the military when President Trump came forward with that ban. Now your work helped to sort of pioneer this area, and now there's a moratorium, I understand, right? What is your hope for this case in the long term? Yeah,
so last July, President Trump announced that transgender people would no longer be allowed to serve in the military, and it was a dramatic change in policy that even the military leaders had no, they weren't told about it in advance. They spoke out.
It was a tweet, I believe.
It was in a tweet, absolutely. They spoke out against it publicly because of the ways in which it made the military less safe. There are thousands of transgender people that have been serving in the military for decades. There had been an extensive study done by the military to evaluate what the impact of that service would be, and the military had concluded that allowing transgender people to serve makes our military stronger. And so we challenged the ban that was announced by President Trump, and the court issued a temporary order halting the ban. So that's a good thing. But the case goes forward, and the president is continuing to defend that ban. So what's really important to recognize here is that it's important that transgender people be allowed to serve. But even more than that, what's really important is to protect this core institution of the military, which is harmed by being whipsawed by sudden changes in policy that have absolutely no basis in fact. And so, you know, the president hasn't even given any justification for prohibiting transgender people from serving, and so that really serves to erode this core bedrock American institution, and that's why we're challenging that ban.
Another case you were instrumental in was back in 2004 when gay marriage was legalized here in Massachusetts, right, and then subsequently in Connecticut. Yep. But when I was doing my research in preparation for this, it was interesting for me to remember that that happened in 2004 and 2008, but federally this issue wasn't taken up or finalized until 2015. Why do you think that there's such a gap between those two?
You know, it's actually a remarkably short span of time in the length of civil rights changes and what we've seen. So, you know, I think that the way in which our federal and state system works is that states can and do make changes based on state constitutional guarantees. That's the way in which the marriage equality case went forward in Massachusetts. What in Massachusetts was actually based on state constitutional guarantees. And so it took some years for the courts to develop the federal equal protection guarantees to a place of recognizing that any ban on same-sex couples being allowed to marry violated those core quality guarantees under the federal Constitution. So cases went forward, and that's one of the things that happened in that decade. But the other thing that happened was that there was a change in the public consciousness about the ways in which all families are really the same at the end of the day, that the core commitment that couples make in terms of loving one another and caring for one another and raising children is really not determined by the gender of the two individuals that enter into that relationship. And we saw a dramatic change of opinion and views across the country as people started to marry in Massachusetts, and people, there's really not a family that's not touched by this dramatic change in law, and ultimately families are made stronger by same-sex couples being allowed to marry. And so there were a lot of changes over the span of that decade, but really it's kind of a fairly quick evolution, and if we look in the context of civil rights changes over time.
One more question. Yeah. Broadly speaking, LGBT, we've heard that acronym for years now, but is there a need now that gay rights have been pioneered, marriage, equality has come forward? Is there a need now to separate and look at gay issues as separate from transgender issues when you're looking at rights in general? Or is it okay that they're synced?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the kinds of discrimination that people experience across that LGBT context are related, but I think we are seeing a deeper and separate focus on transgender civil rights issues, and part of it is because of the emergence of that issue and greater awareness of it. So I think it's good to keep it connected and related, but also recognize those core distinctions as well.
Is there power in keeping them linked, or what do you think the reasoning behind sort of power in numbers, strength in numbers?
Well, I think that the kind of discrimination that people experience is related, that the stereotypes and the presumptions about gender that result in discrimination against LGBT people, lesbian, gay, bisexual people, is really very similar to the kinds of discrimination and bias that transgender people face, again, because of those gender-based stereotypes.